Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, and happy May Day. On this May Day, two big stories about the minimum wage in America. In Seattle, a victory. Political and business leaders today announced they have reached a deal to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It's the highest in the United States, to be phased in over the next few years. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., a vote on a national minimum wage hike to $10.10, though garnering a majority vote of 54 to 42, fell short of overcoming a Republican filibuster. So, what explains the difference, aside from the obvious politics that Seattle's a pretty liberal town and that the U.S. Senate can't get a single piece of legislation through without a supermajority, thanks to Republicans' routine abuse of the filibuster? But another part of the difference is that, in Seattle, there is sufficient pressure from the left. In November of last year, Kshama Sawant, a socialist, an avowed socialist, was elected to Seattle City Council. She backed efforts to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and she leads a grassroots group called 15 Now. A business coalition in Seattle countered, and while they agreed to the headline figure of $15 an hour, they wanted some key qualifiers, like a temporary training wage, a phase-in period for health care, commissions, tips, and bonuses to be counted in total wages. The deal announced by Seattle Mayor Ed Murray today was a compromise, and he had this to say about the achievement.
Cities have often been the incubators of democracy. And Seattle, I think, will prove itself when this process is finished in council to once again be an incubator of democracy, to be a city that once again does great things by showing how we as a city can lead the conversation in the nation to address this growing problem in our society, the growing problem of income inequality.
In Seattle, pressure from the left is not unlike the original movement that brought us the 40-hour work week, that started the May Days that we now, well, kind of celebrate but don't really. In so many crucial areas of progress, demands that at first seemed unreasonable, we shouldn't have to work all the time every second of every day, demands that even seemed preposterous, become more reasonable over time. In Washington, though, this dynamic plays out largely in reverse. That is, the right demands the preposterous and stakes out the most extreme position and then attempts to drag the middle towards them. As Brian Beutler of the New Republic points out in a piece about that minimum wage filibuster, Republicans don't want to deal on this issue because from where they stand, tolerating the existing minimum wage is a concession. Republicans don't often publicly admit that they would like to abolish the minimum wage, although Senator Lamar Alexander confessed it to Senator Bernie Sanders last year.
Well, let me jump in. I don't believe in it.
You do not?
We can debate. I do not.
All right. So you do not believe in the concept of the minimum wage?
That's correct.
You would abolish the minimum wage?
Correct.
Today, Senator Tom Coburn said there should be no national minimum wage at all.
We don't know what the minimum wage should be. How'd they pick 10.10? Why not 22? Why not $100? I don't believe you ought to interfere in the market. If there's to be a minimum wage, my theory is if Oklahomans want a minimum wage, we ought to have it. I don't believe there ought to be a national minimum wage. That's my position. I'm the only member of the Republican Party that's still here that voted no on the last one.
Now, under those conditions, you get what we got today, or yesterday, a filibuster against even allowing a debate and a vote on the minimum wage. The GOP is the party so often pushing out the edge of what's possible. They're the ones making preposterous demands that then somehow become integrated into the national conversation. And if there's one thing to learn from Seattle, or to learn from the original May Day, it is that sometimes what starts as a preposterous demand becomes the center if you say it long enough, and if you organize, and if you fight to make it happen. And Seattle, the ones making those seemingly preposterous demands, were speaking from the left. Joining me now is Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts. She's author of A Fighting Chance, which is out now. Senator, I read your statement, your floor statement about the filibuster of the minimum wage raise that happened in the Senate. You were impassioned and angry, I think it's fair to say. My big question is, why do Republican senators think they will pay no political cost for that vote yesterday?
You know, I don't know why anyone, frankly, would be voting against the minimum wage. And there are multiple ways you can look at this, but the way I think about this is I can think of 14 million reasons to raise the minimum wage, and that's the number of children whose economic fortunes would be lifted if the minimum wage moved to $10.10 an hour. Children who would have more, who would be in homes that are more secure. 1 million adults that would be lifted out of poverty if we raised the minimum wage. And you would think that Republicans would be interested in this, because the more self-sufficient people can be, then the less money that all of the taxpayers have to spend on supplements, on Medicaid, on food stamps. This is about people who work full-time, who are out there really busting their tails, trying to support themselves and their families, and just raising the minimum wage enough that they can make that happen.
So I agree with you. I think you and I agree on the argument of the merits. Mm-hmm. My question is, you're a U.S. senator, you're in D.C. legislating, and so when you're thinking to yourself, well, you and your fellow colleagues in the Democratic caucus, how do we get the 4 more votes to break the filibuster we need? Bob Corker voted yesterday. I mean, if the arguments on the merits aren't persuasive, what is? What is the mechanism of leverage that you or any Democrat has in the United States Senate right now to bring over the 4 votes you need to break a filibuster?
Well, Chris, the way you frame this question is, why is it they believe they don't have to pay a price? And I think what that really goes to, it's what I go to and talk about in the book, A Fighting Chance, is this question about how the game is rigged here in Washington. Yep. And that, what you hear from in the halls of Congress are all of the people who've got money and power right now, the big corporations that say, hey, we think it might affect our bottom line. We might not be able to do as big a return to our shareholders, or we may have to cut our CEO's bonus, by just a little smidge in order to cover our workers on minimum wage. And so, Washington is a place that too often is responding to those who already have money and power, and they're not the ones who need a raise in the minimum wage. Let's face it, people who are working at minimum wage don't have the same kind of army of lawyers and lobbyists that the big corporations do.
This gets to what I like best about your book, which was someone who is still, in some senses, seeing Washington from an outsider's perspective, despite the fact you are now a member of one of the most exclusive clubs in the country. And you tell this story that I'm going to quote this anecdote forever. It's about meeting with Larry Summers. You say, Larry leaned back in his chair, offered me some advice. I had a choice. I could be an insider or I could be an outsider. Outsiders can say whatever they want, but people on the inside don't listen to them. Insiders, however, get lots of access and a chance to push their ideas. Powerful people listen to what they have to say, but insiders also understand one unbreakable rule. They don't criticize other insiders. Mm-hmm. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I got the message. I think I had been warned. And I got the message and just decided that's not what I think is right. For me, this really is the fundamental question about how Washington is going to work going forward. Is it really just going to be a game of insiders, of people who've got money and power, and they're able to influence those on the inside to continue to write rules that work for them? Or are we really going to have a country and a Washington and policies that work for everybody else? And the only way that's going to happen is if everybody else's voice gets heard and their votes get heard. So for me, this is fundamental power in Washington and how we're going to write the rules going forward. That's what this book is about.
So here's the question. To get from point A to point B, right? For point A, which is the rules are rigged, to point B, which is a more fully democratic republic in which people on a minimum wage's voices are being heard, right? Yep. You individually decided to run for Senate. Now you're in the Senate making these votes. But in a broader structural sense, I mean, when you talk about the game being rigged, you were very critical of the 2005 bankruptcy reform bill, passed a bipartisan bill. There's lots of things that happen in a bipartisan way that benefit banks and don't necessarily benefit working people. Yep. Has that gotten better over the time? Is the Democratic Party more accountable now, say, to working people than it was back in 2005 when so many of those Democrats voted for that bankruptcy bill?
Well, look, it's hard to do the comparison over time, because the answer is there are sometimes when things work out very badly and sometimes when they work out well. Because one of the stories I tell at length in here is about the idea behind the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an idea that we would build this agency that would help level the playing field between the big financial institutions and ordinary families so they didn't get cheated on credit cards and mortgages. The big banks hated that agency. I mean, hate it.
Oh, they
said they
tried to kill it every single way.
That's right.
Knives, guns, bazookas, everything.
You bet. It's all there. And they were spending more than $1 million a day lobbying against financial reforms, and the consumer agency was right at the center of that was the thing that had to go. And yet, remember how this story comes out, spoiler alert, how the story comes out. We got the consumer agency. Not only did we get the consumer agency, we got a tough version of the consumer agency. Oh, but one more part. A consumer agency that has already gotten out there and returned more than $3 billion directly to American families who were cheated by big financial institutions.
So why did that fight win? Why did you win that fight? Why did we win that fight? Why did American consumers win that fight against the big banks when they lose so many?
Because this is one where I think we got organized on the outside. We got groups together. We got individuals together. We peppered people when they came home. Senators were home and congressmen were home with questions from their constituents. We got organized and we fought. We fought hard. One of the stories in the book is about the day I learned that the agency was dead and what the response was on our side, and that was how many days before you make it public that it's dead? The answer, 3 weeks. We said, okay, we got 3 weeks to make this happen, and boy, that's what we did. Man the barricades, we were ready to fight. Because, you know, Chris, that's part of it. You can't get what you don't fight for.
I think what you just said, what you just articulated, I think gets to one of the reasons that a lot of people look to you as a kind of leader in the Democratic Party. And I'm not going to ask you if you're going to run for president. You've been asked that question. You've answered it to my satisfaction. What I want to know from you, though, is why do you think people keep asking you? Which is to say, why do people want you to run for president? How do you understand the thing that it is in you or your message that is making folks want you to run?
So, I think this fundamentally is about the issues. I think it's about the underlying understanding that most Americans have that the game is rigged and that it's rigged against them, and that we've got to have our voices heard on the other side, that we can't hand this country over to the biggest financial institutions, to the biggest corporations, to the billionaires who keep writing one rule after another that just tilts the playing field a little bit more. Whether we're talking about student loans, whether we're talking about minimum wage, whether we're talking about Social Security, whether we're talking about accountability when the banks break the law, all of those people understand over and over. The game is rigged. We're running out of time. It's up to us to fight back, to level the playing field, to give ourselves, to give our kids a fighting chance.
Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, who I first discovered when she wrote The Two-Income Trap many years ago, which I bought in a used bookstore because it was blurbed by Teddy Kennedy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Coming up, Gerry Adams, the leader of the Irish political party Sinn Féin, who has received the support of many American politicians over the years, has been arrested for one of the most controversial murders of the Troubles in Ireland more than 40 years ago. You will not believe what led police to him. That story is next.